on alternatives to use of force, de-escalation, and mental and behavioral health and suicidal crisis.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on Senate 4003.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, S. 4003, the Law Enforcement De-Escalation Training Act of 2022, is bipartisan legislation that would improve training for law enforcement officers, including using alternatives to force and de-escalation tactics. It also includes training and support for officers working with mental health professionals and crisis intervention teams. This bill would empower police and the mental health professionals working with them to link individuals to services in their community. Law enforcement officers are often the first responders to individuals in crisis. While we have worked to develop and implement non-law enforcement crisis response services, there continues to be a need to train and equip law enforcement officers to de-escalate interactions and divert individuals to appropriate mental and behavioral health services. Additionally, there is a need to provide officers and crisis response teams the tools they need to understand and respond to individuals with disabilities. One study found that disabled individuals make up 1/3 to 1/2 of all people killed by law enforcement officers. Reforms to law enforcement, including de-escalation training, both improve public safety and reduce crime. A study of the Louisville, Kentucky Police Department found that de-escalation training reduced use of force incidents by 28% and community member injuries by 26%. Officer injuries were reduced by an even larger margin of 36%. S. 4003 will require the Department of Justice's Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services to consult with a broad range of stakeholders in developing the training curriculum, including law enforcement and behavioral health groups, as well as civil rights and civil liberties groups and associations that represent individuals with disabilities. This bill also requires the National Institute of Justice and the Government Accountability Office to evaluate the implementation of the program and the effect of the training, to ensure that the curricula have a tangible impact on law enforcement encounters with people in crisis, and to identify possible changes that would further improve outcomes. This bipartisan bill improves public safety by developing and implementing evidence-based de-escalation training for law enforcement officers. I want to thank Senator Cornyn for introducing the bill and Congresswoman Karen Bass for leading the House version of this important legislation. I urge all of my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senate Bill 4003 creates a new federal grant program to provide training for law enforcement officers on de-escalation techniques, participation in crisis intervention teams, making referrals to community-based service providers, safely responding to individuals in a behavioral or mental health crisis, and alternatives to use of force. It requires the Department of Justice to develop training curriculum in collaboration with mental health providers, law enforcement agencies, civil rights organizations, and other stakeholders. It also authorizes $133 million in new money over the next 4 years with no offsets. There are several problems with this legislation. First, the COPS office at the Justice Department currently funds programs that already do what this bill purports to support. For instance, the COPS office funds the Community Policing Development De-escalation Training Program through 2 different mechanisms. Through one mechanism, the COPS office provides $3 million over the next 2 years for the expansion of a network of regional centers to provide nationally certified de-escalation training opportunities for law enforcement. The other mechanism, Law Enforcement Agency De-escalation Grants, provides nearly $12 million in grant funding over the next 2 years to support whole agency de-escalation, implicit bias, and duty to intervene training efforts. These programs are appropriated and up and running as we speak. We should not be creating new programs that are duplicative of current programs without at least examining the efficacy of the currently funded programs. Second, this legislation represents a departure from traditional law enforcement techniques, one that advances a soft on crime approach. In recent years, these kinds of approaches to fighting crime have been a boon to criminals and have led to our current crime epidemic. We need to seriously address the crime epidemic, not fund duplicative programs that would keep cops in cars. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Wisconsin reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 4 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, a member of the committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank the Speaker, and I ask unanimous consent to speak for the time allotted.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank you. I rise to counter my good friend and indicate that this is important legislation. It's documented to be important legislation. And the documentation is clear because of the widespread support of such a wide range of Americans. I wanted to rise today on the floor to support S4003 and thank my colleagues, Senator Cornyn from Texas and my colleague, Congresswoman Bass. As this legislation came out of judiciary, as well, this is legislation that fits very well under the Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, which I chair. Because our responsibilities are to address the question of crime, but also to address the question of social justice and reform. And we have heard over the last couple of months, many of us have been in the mode of campaigning, challenges against Democrats as to whether or not we're tough on crime, or whether or not we can work to protect our communities. Well, one thing that protects our communities is a strong law enforcement that knows how to engage with the community and is given the tools that will help them do so. And to help the community engage with law enforcement, that they can collectively solve crime. This legislation is a bipartisan bill that would improve public safety and strengthen public trust in law enforcement, one of the first stops toward bringing down crime. S4003 would require the Department of Justice to develop de-escalation training curriculum in consultation and collaboration with mental health providers, law enforcement agencies, civil rights organizations, and associations representing individuals with mental health diagnosis. How many times have mothers and fathers had to deal with the loss of a child because they were having a mental health episode? This legislation continues to be a need to improve the practices that law enforcement officers can use to reduce use of force incidences and also protect themselves. When individuals in crisis, police are often the first to respond. We understand that is not their total responsibility. But because of our lack of access to mental health resources, they have been on the front lines. And so without training necessary to recognize a mental health crisis, someone winds up injured or dead. Interactions between law enforcement and civilians can escalate to potentially deadly consequences. As the country faces an epidemic of violence committed by officers and the disproportionate impact that has this violence on people of color, we remember the lives lost to police violence, including Nicholas Chavez, who was killed by law enforcement, among others in cities across the land. Just this week, we learned that 2 Colorado deputies killed Christian Glass in June have been indicted. That was a sad circumstance. We wish it had not happened, and it did not need to happen. This legislation will give us the opportunity, again, to do what we want to do, to keep America safe, to bring down crime, and to protect our officers, and to give them the training that helps them to be able to engage in de-escalation training. Somewhat similar to the overall bill that we introduced, and I introduced, John Conyers before me, I introduced the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, which I hope to reintroduce again, and seeking bipartisan support. This would authorize $70 million in annual grant funding for training that includes improving community officer relations and to engage in training on use of force or de-escalation, scenario-based exercises, In addition, this bill would provide support to law enforcement agencies to train and equip officers. This legislation, of course, is widely supported.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the generated additional 30 seconds.
I thank the chairman. This legislation is widely supported. It is bipartisan. And I want to thank Mayor-elect Karen Bass, Congresswoman Bass, for her leadership on the companion bill. And I'd very much like to thank my colleague, Senator Cornyn, out of Texas, for his commitment and concern. I quickly want to acknowledge that the faith community is squarely in support of this, and they certainly care about law enforcement and bringing down crime. Catholic Charities, Catholic Prison Ministry, Jesuit Conference, National Association of Evangelicals, National Latino Evangelical, among others, CPAC, National Fraternal Order of Police, and any number of others whose letters I ask unanimous consent to place into the record. I ask my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
Without objection, gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, is recognized.
Gentleman from New York, I do not have any further speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Natler, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, S4003 is bipartisan legislation that would improve training for law enforcement officers, including using alternatives to force and de-escalation tactics. This training will reduce use of force incidents and improve officer and community safety. I cannot imagine how anybody can think this will somehow increase crime. Senator Cornyn, who's not known to be soft on crime, is the major Senate sponsor. I urge all members to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Members, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 4003? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being the affirmative, for what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S3846, the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Reauthorization Act of 2022, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 3846, an act to reauthorize the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Natler, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Natler.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on S3846.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, S3846, the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Reauthorization Act of 2022, is bipartisan legislation that would reauthorize and make necessary improvements to the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program, or JMHCP, within the Department of Justice. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, communities across the country have grappled with worsened mental health. There continues to be a need to adequately address the mental health needs of our communities and to redirect people in crisis away from the criminal justice system and into the healthcare system. State and local governments use JMHCP grants for critical services to address the mental health needs of their communities, including by establishing diversion programs, creating or expanding community-based treatment programs, supporting the development of curricula for police academies and orientations, and providing in-jail treatment and transitional services. Additionally, grant funds are used to train law enforcement on identifying and improving their responses to people experiencing a mental health crisis. This program, which was first created in 2004, was reauthorized in 2008 and again in 2016 with bipartisan support. S3846 will make needed improvements to the grant program by strengthening support for mental health courts and crisis intervention teams, supporting diversion programming and training for state and local prosecutors, strengthening support for corresponder teams, and supporting the integration of the National Suicide Prevention and Mental Health Crisis Hotline System into the existing public safety system. This bill will also increase allowable uses for grant funds to include suicide prevention in jails and clarify that crisis intervention teams can be placed in 911 call centers. This bipartisan bill improves the efficacy of the JMHCP grant program and is supported by a wide range of stakeholders, including the Addiction Policy Forum, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Major Cities Chiefs Association, Major County Sheriffs of America, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and many others. I want to thank Senator Cornyn for introducing the bill and Congressman Bobby Scott for introducing the House version of this important legislation. I urge all of my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask to yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. S 3846 makes a number of changes to the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program. The Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program is a Department of Justice program that assists states, local governments, and Indian tribes with providing treatment to individuals with mental health problems and substance abuse disorders that come into contact with the criminal justice system. This bill allows funds under this program to be used for crisis intervention teams and co-responder teams made up of law enforcement officers and mental health professionals. These teams can be placed within 911 call centers to better respond to individuals facing mental health challenges. It also allows funds under this program to help state and local governments implement the 988 universal telephone number, which is the National Suicide Prevention and Mental Health Crisis Hotline. This legislation also authorizes $2 million for each of the next 5 years for the Department of Justice to report on the prevalence of mentally ill offenders in the criminal justice system. While this bill is well-intentioned, more needs to be done to address the surge of violent crime this nation has seen over the past 3 years. Violent crime is especially bad in Democrat-run cities with rogue leftist prosecutors who don't enforce the laws on the books, and in cities that have demonized and defunded their police departments. I would point you to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's no wonder that 27 of the 30 cities with the highest homicide rates have Democratic mayors. We need to keep violent criminals behind bars and put an end to soft-on-crime policies that are wreaking havoc on our communities. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Wisconsin reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Natler, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, member of the committee, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee, is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Let me rise and, first of all, to thank the chairman and to thank the sponsor, my friend from Virginia, Congressman Bobby Scott. As I think of my dear friend from Virginia, let me also acknowledge my deep sadness for the loss of our dear friend, Congressman McEachin, and acknowledge the beauty of his service and, of course, his compassion and his true spirit of being a true American hero. And I thank Congressman Scott for this work. And I'll quickly say that any of us who've been engaged in the criminal justice arena, who've engaged with police officers, whether they are local, state, or federal, those of us who've served as judges, understand the value of this important legislation. It is bipartisan, and it will build on the success of the JMHCP grant program and make necessary improvements to enable state and local governments to better serve their communities. This reauthorization will make critical improvements to the JMHCP program, which supports services for individuals with mental health issues who are involved in the criminal justice system, including expansions in suicide prevention in jails and prisons, co-responder programs that pair law enforcement with mental health professionals, and, of course, recognizing that though we give them this responsibility, that law enforcement needs to have a wraparound services and those that have the expertise to work with those suffering from mental health crisis. With the continued impact of COVID-19 pandemic, communities across the country have suffered increased challenges in addressing mental health. And we as Democrats have consistently said that we need a holistic approach. Again, I've said that we take no back seat to fighting crime and being successful, but we understand public safety and civil rights. I want to thank Chairman Scott for acknowledging where we are at a loss. That is people who are suffering from mental health issues. Now, we have had a series of mass murders, mass killings, of course, using the weapon of choice for young men who espouse hatred, but many have been determined or assessed to have had mental health crisis issues. At least that has been the defense. We now need to really invest in this program and ensure that this is a national program. In 2018, Harris County Mental Health Jail Division expanded as an alternative to jail, diverting individuals with mental health illnesses away from incarceration. I want to see this program grow. The updated diversion program allows law enforcement to direct individuals with mental illness over to these programs, those picked up for low-level, nonviolent offenses. And many of us know that these are sometimes homeless persons, and many of these persons are veterans. By the way, we have a veterans court in Harris County. So I am excited about this bipartisan legislation that would also support state implementation of the newly established 988 suicide crisis hotline. I ask my colleagues to support this legislation, and I have submission of articles subsequently. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Gentleman from New York, I am prepared to close.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin reserved. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I rise in support of the Justice, Mental Health, and Collaboration Reauthorization Act. The Justice, Mental Health, and Collaboration Program was authorized through the Mentally Ill Offender Treatment and Crime Reduction Act, what we call MIOCRA, legislation that I was proud to work on nearly 20 years ago as then ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. This legislation has proven to be successfully connect state and local governments with necessary resources to plan and implement initiatives designed to increase public safety, save tax dollars on ineffective or even counterproductive incarceration, and improve the lives of people with mental illness and their families. These grants for states and localities allow for the development of programming that connects those with mental illnesses and substance use issues with evidence-based and comprehensive treatment within the criminal justice system. Each year, there are about 2 million people with serious mental illnesses admitted to jails across the country. In fact, according to the National Alliance of Mental Illness, 44% of those in jail and 37% of those in prisons have a history of mental illness. Furthermore, once incarcerated, individuals with mental illness tend to stay in jail longer and upon release are more likely to return to incarceration than those without mental illnesses. These grants encourage collaboration between law enforcement and healthcare providers. The reforms in this program included in this reauthorization are centered on reducing suicide, increasing access to case management services, bolstering the roles of co-responder and crisis intervention teams, and continuing the strong support of mental health courts. This bill recognizes that prevention is the best investment in the criminal justice system for long-term success and cost savings. This legislation is the result of hard work of many, including state government organizations, mental health organizations, law enforcement organizations. And I'd like to thank all of those colleagues that have led this effort with me, including Representative Shabbat, Jackson Lee, Elmer, of course, the chairman of the committee, Mr. Nadler, as well as Senators Cornyn, Klobuchar, Moran, Durbin, Grassley, Whitehouse, Tillis, and Cortez Masto. Mr. Speaker, I hope that colleagues will join me in supporting the reauthorization of this legislation so we can get it to the President's desk before the end of the year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, is recognized.
Gentleman from New York, I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program funds a variety of essential services to support the mental health needs of communities across the country and redirect people in crisis away from the criminal justice system and into the healthcare system. This legislation would reauthorize and strengthen this important program so that it can continue to serve those in need of its services. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields back. Members, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 3846 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, for what purpose does the gentleman from Montana seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would request the yeas and nays, please.
The yeas and nays will request that all those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.